They saw a man in a hoodie, not knowing he owned the floor beneath their feet. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Humiliated in the halls he paid for, his silence became their mirror. One complaint exposed a system. One man changed it without a word. This isn't just a story about power, it's about how you use it. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The hospital was bright, almost too bright for a place meant to hold pain. People passed through the sliding glass doors, like ghosts moving between realities, some seeking answers, others escaping consequences. The nurses at the reception desk barely looked up anymore. They had learned to recognize emergencies, not by words, but by the way a person walked hurried steps, shaking hands, eyes darting to every door like salvation hid behind one of them. But this man, he didn't walk in like that. He moved slowly, with a deliberate calm that didn't match the chaos around him. He stood well over 7 feet, shoulders like boulders under a gray hoodie that hung loose around his body. His hands were tucked into his pockets, his face mostly obscured by the shadow of his hood. His sneakers were scuffed but not cheap. His sweatpants were clean, but ordinary. No designer tags, no entourage. No one recognized him. Not like this. He found an empty chair in the far corner of the waiting room, away from the vending machines, out of reach of the humming fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. A child sitting 2 seats away nudged his mother, pointing toward the man. She glanced over once, tugged her son's hand, and whispered something under her breath. They moved. The man didn't look up. He just folded his hands in his lap and waited. At the nurse's station, the front desk tech with the acrylic nails and heavy lashes leaned over to her coworker and nodded toward the hoodie. He's been here like 20 minutes. Ain't checked in. Just sitting there. Her colleague, flipping through paperwork, didn't glance up. Could be waiting on someone. Yeah, well, she said, lowering her voice. This ain't a bus stop. Security should have seen him by now. 2 more nurses joined in the whisper circle. Someone laughed under their breath. Someone said the word sketchy. None of them walked over to ask. None of them thought twice about why a man that size might choose silence over attention. Behind the hoodie was a heartbeat louder than most. A man who had spent a lifetime in arenas full of noise and faces. A man who had made millions, lost people, raised children, buried friends. A man whose hands had built more schools and fed more families than the entire board of the hospital combined. But right now he wasn't Big Shaq. Not Superman. Not the Hall of Famer. Just a son. Lucille O'Neill was in that hospital, 2 floors up. She had fainted at home the night before routine checkups had turned urgent after a second collapse. The doctors said it was precautionary. Shaq didn't trust precautions. So he came, quietly, without the fanfare, without calling ahead. He didn't want the cameras or the chaos. He just wanted his mother to be okay. He had designed this hospital with that exact wish in mind, to make it a place where fear didn't grow in the hallways, where people were treated like people, not cases. It bore no plaque with his name. That was intentional. The staff knew the board, they knew the donors, but they didn't know him. Not like this. The security guard near the elevator glanced toward the man in the hoodie. He tapped his radio, then leaned against the wall like he was trying to decide whether to intervene. Another nurse, a younger one with earbuds half tucked into her ears, walked past and threw the man a brief glance. Her eyes narrowed. She kept walking, but the seed of suspicion had already been planted. Inside the waiting room, the television mounted to the wall played a muted segment of morning news. A familiar voice could be seen giving a community award to a local school. The camera panned, and for a flash of a second, there he was. Big Shaq in a tailored suit handing out scholarships to 3 inner-city teens. The hoodie in the corner didn't even look up. A doctor walked into the reception area. Clean white coat, expensive watch, phone glued to his hand. He paused, looked toward the man, and frowned. Anyone know who that is? He asked the front desk. They shook their heads. One of the nurses chimed in. Been here a while. No check-in. The doctor raised an eyebrow. Security aware? They're watching, someone said. He gave a tight nod and walked off. His judgment already made. Shaq shifted slightly in his seat, stretching one leg forward. The chairs around him were mostly empty now. People always gave space to what they feared, or didn't understand, and there was something about a man that size, that quiet, that made folks uneasy. It didn't help that he didn't look angry or sad, just still. He checked his phone, No updates. Lucille was still in observation. He texted one of the senior administrators, a woman he trusted, just to let her know he was in the building, but that he didn't want a scene. No badge, no greeting, just time. The moments crawled by. A mother walked in with her teenage daughter, limping and holding her side. They sat across from him. Shaq watched quietly as the girl winced, her hands clenched tight in her hoodie. The mother looked scared, but tried not to show it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a mint, slid it quietly across the table toward them. The mother looked at him for the first time, her eyes softening. She nodded. Just once. Elsewhere, a nurse whispered again, this time into a walkie. Patient hallway violation. Subject still here. Possible security breach. Shaq didn't move. A nurse manager appeared from behind the glass sliding door, clipboard in hand. She scanned the room, then walked directly toward him. Her heels clicked on the linoleum. When she stopped in front of him, her voice was polite, but edged with caution. Sir, this area is for registered visitors only. Are you waiting on a patient? He looked up, slowly, eyes tired, but kind. My mother, he said, voice low.
Name?
Lucille O'Neill. She blinked. Relation? I'm her son. The nurse didn't flinch, didn't react. She scribbled something on the clipboard and said, you'll need to remain in the general waiting area. We'll let you know if we receive any updates. He nodded. Thank you. She turned and walked away. He sat back. A few feet away, one of the security guards finally stepped forward, approaching the reception desk. You sure that's no one important? The nurse shrugged. He looks like someone. But the guard narrowed his eyes. Heard he's been here a while. Yeah, she said. Some folks just don't know when to leave. Shaq heard it. Every word. And still, he didn't move. Because this wasn't the time. But the time was coming. And when it did, the man in the hoodie would no longer be invisible. He would be the storm no one saw coming. The man they tried to humiliate, sitting in a chair he paid for, waiting on a system he built, holding his pain like a crown. They saw a shadow. But they were about to meet the man who built the roof over their heads. At the front desk, behind the shield of polished plexiglass and perfumed pens, the receptionist leaned over her keyboard with the detached air of someone who had done this job too long to care. The morning intake was backed up, phones ringing off the hook, names being called every 5 seconds. But when she caught a glimpse of the tall man sitting silently across the room, something in her gut told her to double-check. Not out of concern, out of assumption. She pulled up the VIP registry. The hospital had its list. A quiet file of benefactors, political names, corporate players, and celebrities. It wasn't official, not on paper anyone could quote. But everyone at the hospital knew it existed. The list meant you skipped lines. You got the corner suite. You got called sir before you even spoke. And more importantly, it meant people knew who you were. She typed quickly, tapping the keys with acrylic-tipped fingers. Her eyes skimmed the roster, and she frowned. Not here, she muttered. Her coworker, an older woman with tight curls and tired eyes, looked over. Who you looking for? I don't know, the younger one replied, glancing toward the waiting area. He just looks like someone. The older woman raised an eyebrow. If he was someone, he'd be on the list. The words landed with a finality that only bureaucracy can provide. Meanwhile, Shaq sat in the same seat he'd been in for nearly 40 minutes. His long frame shifted slightly, but not from discomfort, from patience stretching thin. He'd texted Clarissa, the nurse manager he trusted, but hadn't heard back, probably buried under rounds. He understood. Hospitals moved in rhythms, most of them broken. He didn't flinch when a young man in a long white coat passed him by, nose buried in a tablet. But he caught the glance. Quick, disdainful, almost instinctual. That was Dr. Cullen Cross, fresh out of residency, fast-tracked into internal medicine, and carrying the swagger of someone who still believed degrees could mask character. He glanced once at the hoodie, once at the sneakers, and curled his lip. This floor's for real families, he muttered under his breath, not caring whether it was heard. Shaq heard it.
He always heard it.
He was used to the snide assumptions, the covert disrespect that came without confrontation. In a room full of suits, he'd seen people assume he was security. At fundraisers, they'd ask if he was the entertainment.
Never mind the articles.
The interviews, the legacy. People saw what they wanted to see. And right now, they wanted to see a man who didn't belong. He clenched his jaw, not in anger, but in memory. There was a time when Lucille had taken him into a hospital just like this. He was 10. She'd worked 3 jobs to get him a pair of shoes without holes. He remembered sitting in a cold chair while she argued with billing about insurance. The nurse back then didn't see her fear, didn't hear the panic beneath her polite tone. They had waited hours, ignored like wallpaper, while others were called ahead. He had watched his mother's pride bend but never break. He had promised himself then, one day, I'll build a place where no one feels like this again. That place was this hospital. But somehow, here he was, living that same pain again. The irony wasn't just cruel, it was loud. Across the room, another nurse joined the desk. She scanned the intake clipboard and noticed a red mark next to room patient Lucille O'Neill still under observation. She asked, "Yeah, family checked in?" The receptionist asked. She glanced up. "No, but there's someone out there asking." The younger receptionist looked again toward Shaq, then leaned forward typing quickly. She pulled up Lucille's profile. No emergency contact listed.
That was intentional, too.
Shaq had always kept his name off medical records, not out of secrecy, but to protect his mother's privacy. She liked her peace, and he honored that. Still, the nurse looked back at the tall man with the hood drawn low. That might be him. Might, the receptionist echoed. But if he was, wouldn't he have said something? That was the thing, wasn't it? People expected you to announce your worth, to wear your status like a badge. Shaq had done that life. He'd played under stadium lights, posed for magazine covers, signed autographs until his wrist cramped. But this moment wasn't about being seen. It was about his mother. It was always about her. And the list? He never put his name on it. He didn't want to skip lines, didn't want rose petals at his feet. He wanted fairness to be the standard, not the exception. But fairness didn't seem to live here this morning. At that moment, Clarissa finally emerged from the east corridor. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her brow damp, but she moved with purpose. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on the familiar frame in the corner. She blinked, then quickly approached. Shaq stood as she neared. His towering frame made her look like a teenager next to him. "You should have texted sooner," she whispered, hugging him briefly. "I didn't want a scene." "Well, you got one anyway. Come with me." As they walked, the young receptionist watched from her desk, confusion creeping across her face. "Wait, was that?" The older woman beside her chuckled dryly. "You ever watch basketball?" A slow realization sank in. The receptionist turned back to her screen. Her heart thudded. She opened the VIP list again, searched the name Shaquille O'Neal. Still nothing. "Why wouldn't he be on the list?" she whispered. "Because people like him don't need to be," came the answer. In the hallway, Clarissa led Shaq to a private room near the ICU. It wasn't luxurious, just quiet. It gave him a view of the nurse's station, and a line of sight toward room 312, where Lucille was resting. "She's stable," Clarissa said. "Docs are running blood work again. Nothing critical yet." Shaq exhaled. "Thank you. You sure you don't want to let them know who you are?" He shook his head. "If I gotta do that just to be treated decent, then we've already lost." Clarissa nodded. She'd known him long enough to know he meant it. Back at the front desk, Dr. Cullen Cross approached with a cup of overpriced coffee, and the same arrogance he always carried. "Any update on the guy in the hoodie?" The receptionist didn't answer right away. "Well?" he pressed. She cleared her throat. "He's with the patient." Dr. Cross paused. "Oh. He family?" She looked at him. Really looked at him this time. "Yeah, you could say that." "Name?" "Shaquille O'Neal." His jaw twitched. "No kidding." "Nope." He blinked. Laughed under his breath. "Didn't look like him." She tilted her head. "What does he look like?" The silence that followed was sharp enough to slice through the air. Back in the private waiting area, Shaq sat again. Clarissa brought him water and patted his shoulder. "I'll keep you posted." "Appreciate it." As she left, he stared out the window, watching the city pulse in the distance. It didn't matter how many buildings he owned, how many schools bore his name. In some rooms, he'd always be just another guy. But that was okay, because he wasn't here to prove anything. He was here to witness, to remember, to make sure that one day the list wouldn't matter. Not because everyone was on it, but because no one needed to be. And as the hospital moved around him, oblivious to the storm it had nearly invited, the man who built it all sat quietly, proof that real power doesn't need recognition. It needs purpose. Dr. Nathaniel Aldridge didn't walk. He announced his presence. Every step was deliberate, every pivot theatrical, as if the hospital floors themselves bent slightly under his Prada soles. His coat was tailored tighter than regulation, starched into submission. The name embroidered above his heart, Dr. Nan Aldridge, MD, flashed like a badge, not a credential. If there were an award for most visible confidence, he would have hung it in his office beside his Ivy League diplomas. He liked to make rounds mid-morning, when the hospital was loudest, patients most anxious, and staff just tired enough not to challenge his authority. That's when he could truly perform. He called it presence. Others, especially the nurses, called it something less flattering behind closed doors. As he strode past the glass corridor, lining the ICU, his eye caught something he didn't like. A man, a big man, slumped quietly in a chair just beyond the entrance to the restricted zone. Hoodie up, head bowed, massive frame hunched into the kind of stillness that somehow made it more noticeable. There was no ID badge, no chart in hand, no movement. To Aldridge, there was no context, just inconvenience. He paused near the nurse's station, glanced toward a nearby RN, and asked with a practiced smirk, "You guys starting to allow walk-ins in the critical care wing?" The nurse, a junior still too green to risk confrontation, just shrugged. "I think he's waiting on a patient." "Oh, you think?" Aldridge repeated, voice dipped in condescension. "Well, thinking doesn't make it policy." He turned sharply, his footsteps echoing louder than they should have. As he approached the seated man, nurses glanced up, curious. Some stiffened, already sensing the tension shift. It was the kind of shift they'd come to recognize around Aldridge, when courtesy left the room and ego entered with a clipboard. Shaq remained still. He'd felt that kind of approach before. He didn't need to look to know what was coming. "Excuse me," Aldridge said, standing in front of him now. "This area is restricted to authorized personnel and approved visitors only." Shaq didn't flinch. "I'm waiting on my mother," he said simply, voice like smooth stone. Aldridge crossed his arms. "And you are her son." Aldridge stared at him for a beat, then glanced back toward the station. No one offered help. No one offered interruption. He turned back, raising a brow.
"There's a family registry in the system. I don't see your name on it."
Shaq met his eyes for the first time. "I'm not registered." "Well, that's kind of the point, isn't it?" Aldridge said, lips curling. "This floor isn't for casual visits. It's for real-time care. You understand the importance of maintaining security protocols, I assume." The job wasn't about safety. It was about power. Shaq paused, let the silence stretch. "I do," he replied. "Very well." There was a flicker in Aldridge's expression, like he expected defiance, and wasn't sure how to handle restraint. He pushed forward anyway. "Then I'll need you to return to the main waiting area. ICU patients are in critical condition, and the presence of unauthorized individuals compromises the integrity of the environment." It wasn't a request. It was a performance. Nurses exchanged glances. A few recognized Shaq now. One even opened her mouth to speak, but caught Clarissa's shake of the head from down the hall. "Not yet." Aldridge stepped closer, his voice lowering just enough to sound like concern but not really. "Look, I get it. You want to be near her. But there are procedures. If everyone just walked in and took a seat wherever they pleased, this place would collapse." Shaq stood slowly. Not in defiance, just to his full height. A quiet unfurling. Aldridge stepped back just half a step. But it was noticed. He glanced down at the massive man now towering over him. No aggression, no threat, just presence. "I'll move," Shaq said. "No need to explain it again." Aldridge recovered with a small, clipped nod. "Good. Appreciate your cooperation." Shaq took a few steps back toward the lobby, his broad shoulders calm, his expression unreadable. He didn't look back, didn't speak further. But the air in the corridor had changed. It wasn't just the discomfort of what had happened. It was the unspoken realization that something wasn't right. Not with Shaq's behavior, but with how it was received. Aldridge, now feeling affirmed by his own authority, turned and returned to the station. "That's how this place runs," he muttered to no one in particular. "Discipline. Structure. We're not a hotel lobby." Clarissa appeared moments later, clipboard in hand. "You just spoke with the man outside ICU?" "Yeah," he said, flipping a file. "Some guy loitering in a restricted zone. Already took care of it." She stared at him. "You know who that was?" He shrugged. "No idea. But he needed to be redirected." She leaned in slightly. "That was Shaquille O'Neal. The file in his hand stopped mid-flip. "The Shaquille O'Neal?" he asked, eyes narrowing. She nodded. "He's here for his mother, Lucille O'Neal. She's a patient in..." He laughed, short and skeptical. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." He blinked once, twice. The edges of his smirk faltered. He turned toward the glass corridor and caught a final glimpse of Shaq's retreating figure, now back in the public lounge. He didn't say anything. Aldridge said. He didn't need to. Clarissa walked off, and that was the thing that stuck with Aldridge. No protest. No threat. No flex of status or wealth. Just a man who swallowed humiliation in a place he owned. Quietly. Aldridge tried to refocus. But the noise of his earlier confidence had begun to fade into an uncomfortable echo. His authority had always been built on the assumption that people around him needed his approval. But now, the image of that giant man shrinking himself to make others comfortable unsettled. Something in his core. Later that afternoon, Aldridge typed up a short report. Unregistered individual, escorted from ICU hallway for non-compliance. It was meant to be routine, a note in the file. But it would become a receipt. And receipts, when the truth comes to light, speak louder than titles. Power makes noise. But real power, it waits. That even now, while lying in a hospital room, named after someone else's donation, Lucille was just another patient, and he, her son, was just another body in a hallway until proven otherwise. He looked out the window now, watching a nurse push a wheelchair down the corridor. She looked tired, maybe overworked, maybe she was kind, maybe she wasn't. That was the thing about people, you never knew until you listened. Lucille always listened. She had once sat with a woman crying on the church steps because no one else would. Didn't ask questions. Just handed her a tissue, then later offered her half a sandwich. That woman turned out to be the mayor's assistant. Years later, she helped Lucille bypass a permit roadblock for a community garden. Shaq smiled faintly at the memory. His mother believed in people, even when they didn't believe in themselves. She believed that pain should never be passed on, that just because the world kicked you didn't mean you had to kick someone else. That's why this moment, this hospital, this treatment hurt more than most. Because it wasn't just personal. It was generational. Lucille hadn't just raised children. She raised standards. She raised hopes. She gave the world a gentle giant. Taught him to lift others, not step on them. And yet here they were, still being made to prove they belonged. In another part of the hospital, Dr. Aldridge was probably charting his next rounds, proud of how he had maintained order. Somewhere a nurse was still wondering whether that man in the hoodie had stolen a badge, or wandered too far. No one had stopped to ask his name. No one had asked why he was there. Only how. And that silence spoke volumes. Shaq stood and walked down the hallway toward the vending machine. He didn't need the snack. He needed the walk. He needed the pause. As he passed the main desk again, a young intern looked up and blinked, recognition slowly blooming. He whispered to another staff member. The whisper spread like a ripple across the surface of still water. But Shaq didn't slow down. Let them figure it out on their own. He wasn't here for validation. He was here for Lucille. He pressed a button on the machine, watched a package fall, caught it without looking. As he turned to leave, he passed a janitor mopping the floors. "Hey, big man," the janitor said. "Respect for how you handled that earlier." Shaq nodded once. "You saw?" "I see everything," the man replied. "Some folks, loud with power. Others, they just..." Shaq smiled, small and tired. "Lucille raised me that way." The janitor chuckled. "Then she did good." Back in room 312, Lucille shifted in her sleep, unaware of the tension unraveling beyond her door. She didn't know the looks her son had absorbed, or the judgment he'd swallowed. But if she had, she would have told him what she always did. "You can't fix how they see you, baby, but you can make damn sure they remember what they saw." He intended to do just that. Because this wasn't about teaching anyone a lesson. This was about reminding them who built the walls they now patrolled, and why they were built in the first place. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead couldn't drown out the shift in the hallway's rhythm. There was a current moving beneath the surface, an unease that swept from the nurse's station down to the ICU corridor, like wind before a storm. Shaq felt, not with his ears, but in the pit of his stomach, the weight of eyes, the whisper of assumptions, the kind of tension that didn't need words to be understood. He was back in his chair, near room 312. Clarissa had stepped away to check Lucille's chart, and for a moment he was alone again, Not physically, there were doctors and nurses everywhere, but alone in the way a man can be when the room has already decided who he is. And that's when they arrived. Two security guards emerged from the elevator at the end of the hall. One tall and clean-shaven, carrying himself like a man who still believed in procedure. The other younger, square-jawed, a little too eager, the kind who liked the sound of his own voice once authority was handed to him. The younger one spotted Shaq first and walked straight toward him, eyes narrowed. His hand hovered near his radio, like proximity alone demanded action. The older guard followed, slower, his gaze sharper, more calculating. As they approached, nurses paused their rounds. No one spoke, no one intervened. Shaq didn't move. "Sir," the young guard barked, already in motion. "This area's restricted. I'm gonna need you to come with us." The words landed like a slap that wasn't meant to sting, but did. Shaq looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. "I'm waiting on my mother," he said, voice calm. The young guard didn't blink. He was already in action mode, already writing the ending to a story he hadn't asked for. This hallway's for authorized personnel and immediate family listed in the system. "You're not on the list. He's with patient 312, the older guard said quietly, still watching Shaq. There was something flickering behind his eyes now. Recognition, memory. "Doesn't matter," the younger one snapped. "No ID, no wristband. Not authorized." The older guard leaned in closer, his voice low but edged with something different, doubt. "Is that," he started, not finishing the sentence. Not needing to. Shaq didn't answer. He just sat there. But the phone cameras did. One of the nurses standing behind the medication cart had her phone angled subtly under a chart folder. She wasn't filming for entertainment. She was filming because something about the moment felt too familiar. Too loaded. Too easy to deny later. That kind of denial required evidence. The younger guard stepped forward. "I'm gonna have to escort you out of this hallway, sir. Either you comply or I call this in." There was no aggression in Shaq's face, no resistance in his hands, just heartbreak. The slow, deep kind. The kind that forms cracks without ever raising its voice. He stood. The hallway seemed to inhale as he did. One nurse gasped softly under her breath. The younger guard stepped back, momentarily caught off guard by just how tall this man was. But Shaq didn't use his size. He didn't posture. He simply nodded. "Let's go then," he said. The older guard moved to the side, saying nothing more. The younger one led the way, as if guiding a prisoner, completely unaware of who followed him. The hallway fell silent, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any shouting ever could. As they walked past the nurse's station, someone dropped a pen.
No one picked it up.
The cameras rolled. The nurse behind the desk looked away, shame prickling behind her eyes. She had seen this before, in different forms, different people. She knew this wasn't just about policy. It was about presence, about who was allowed to have it. Shaq didn't glance around, didn't meet the eyes of anyone. But he knew, every step he took wasn't his. It belonged to 100 others who had been ushered out of spaces they helped build, judged before they spoke, assumed before they explained. They reached the waiting lounge. The younger guard motioned toward the chair Shaq had been in earlier that morning. "You can stay here until further notice." Shaq sat down, slowly. The older guard lingered for a second longer. "You're him, right?" he asked quietly. Shaq looked at him. "Just once." The guard nodded, almost to himself. "Thought so." And then he walked away. The young one, still oblivious, checked his radio and turned back toward the elevators. Somewhere down the hall, the camera stopped recording. The seed was planted. The footage wouldn't go viral today, or even tomorrow, but it had begun its journey, passed from one trusted person to another. It would gain momentum not because it was dramatic, but because it was truthful. Because it showed something that couldn't be explained away. A man quiet and respectful, being moved like furniture from a space he belonged to more than any of them. Back in his chair, Shaq rested his hands in his lap and stared ahead. He thought about his mother, about the time she had been turned away from bank counters, mistaken for staff at her own church, asked to show ID while shopping in the same stores that used her son's image on their walls. He thought about how she used to tell him, "Don't you ever let their smallness shrink you." But this wasn't about shrinking. It was about witnessing, letting it happen, letting them believe they had the power. Because power that needs to announce itself isn't real. It's borrowed, temporary, loud enough to draw attention, but not respect. And real power? Real power waits. Not forever. Just long enough to make the truth undeniable. Just long enough to make sure that when the fall comes, it lands on its own arrogance. They didn't know who he was, but they would. Not because he told them, because they filmed their own downfall. This place runs because of your vision, your funding, your heart, but they treated you like a problem. He nodded slowly. It's not about me, he said. It's about what's still broken, what never really healed. Clarissa exhaled. She wanted to say more, but she knew better than to fill silence that wasn't hers to fix. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was an internal memo, unsigned, but unmistakable. The words at the top read, "Formal complaint, unauthorized access violation, security breach, reported by Dr. Nathaniel Aldridge." Shaq took it from her hands, scanning it slowly. His face didn't change, but Clarissa saw it in his shoulders, just the slightest twitch, like the insult landed deeper than the rest. "You filed this?" Shaq asked. Clarissa nodded. "Just turned it in. Sent a copy to admin and legal. Labeled you non-compliant." Shaq stared at the paper for a long moment, then folded it neatly and placed it beside him on the table. "Do they know who I am?" he asked quietly. Clarissa shook her head. "Not yet. Admin hasn't checked the camera logs. No one's put the pieces together." He leaned back in the chair. "Let them file it. Let it go through the system." Clarissa blinked. "You're not going to stop it?"
I don't need to.
He didn't say it with arrogance. He said it with a certainty that was almost spiritual. Clarissa understood. This place was supposed to be different, she whispered, half to herself. "It still can be," he said. "But not if I walk in like a headline. I want to see who they are when they think no one's watching." There was a knock at the door. Clarissa opened it to find a staff courier with a folder in hand. "From Dr. Aldridge's office," the young man said. He asked it be filed immediately. Clarissa took it, eyes narrowing. "I'll take care of it." The boy nodded and left. Inside the folder was another document. A printed email trail. Dr. Aldridge had included a recommendation that the hospital reevaluate its hallway access policy, specifically citing individuals displaying threatening size and demeanor. He hadn't said Shaq's name. He didn't have to. Clarissa held it up. "He didn't just file a complaint," she said, the irony cutting deeper now. "He signed his resignation letter without knowing it." Shaq gave a half smile, the kind that barely made it to his eyes. "I didn't come here to ruin him," he said. "No," Clarissa agreed. "But he did that on his own." They sat for a moment longer. Outside, the world moved forward. Phones ringing, monitors beeping, patients being wheeled through doors they hoped led to better outcomes. But in this room, everything had paused. And in that pause, Clarissa saw something in Shaq she hadn't expected. Not anger, not pride, just resolve. "You could have walked in with cameras," she said. "You could have called press. You could have snapped your fingers and shut this place down." "I could have," he replied. "But then they'd learn nothing." He stood then, tall and steady. "I want them to see what respect looks like when it walks out the door before they even realize it was there." Clarissa nodded. She reached out, squeezed his arm once. "Lucille would be proud. She always is." Before he left the room, she handed him the water again. This time, he took a sip. Out in the hallway, Dr. Aldridge was mid-conversation with another physician, discussing procedural lapses as if he were the architect of order. He didn't see Shaq walk past him, didn't notice the quiet wake that followed in his steps. The nurses looked up. Some whispered. The story had started moving now, not with headlines, but with whispers. And whispers, when true, travel faster than anything else. Shaq returned to his chair in the public waiting room, sat back down like nothing had changed. But everything had. The complaint was filed. The cameras had rolled. The moment had passed. And Clarissa? She was already walking toward admin with the folder in her hands. Because even if they hadn't figured it out yet, the clock had already started. And time was never on the side of the arrogant. The meeting had been called urgently that morning by the hospital's chief operating officer. The reason given, an administrative breach requiring full review. That's all it took to summon the board. A few words, a calendar alert, and the unspoken promise of scandal. Some sat stiffly, others leaned back, assuming this would be another procedural storm, a budget mistake, a HIPAA fine, maybe a whistleblower complaint that could be snuffed out with a legal form and a press release. But the energy in the room was different today, palpable. No one knew exactly why. Until the doors opened, and Shaquille O'Neal walked in. No hoodie. No slouch. No explanation. Just presence. He wore a black tailored blazer over a muted charcoal turtleneck. Simple and clean. His watch was understated. No diamond earrings. No flash. No logo screaming for attention. And yet, the silence that dropped when he entered was deafening. 3 members of the board stood instinctively, as if pulled to their feet by the weight of recognition. Others simply stared, blinking slowly, realizing too late who had just walked into the room they thought they owned. Shaq didn't sit immediately. He walked to the far end of the table, the chair that had always been reserved, but rarely filled. He'd only been in this room 3 times before, and each time it had been by choice, not necessity. Today was different. He nodded to the COO, who cleared his throat, unsure whether to begin or step aside. Shaq spared him the dilemma. "I won't take much of your time," he said, voice steady, deep, and resonant. "But what happened downstairs can't go unaddressed, not because it happened to me, but because it's still happening." The room remained still. Some board members exchanged nervous glances. Still, no one interrupted. Shaq leaned forward slightly, placing both palms on the table like a man anchoring his words with weight. "I walked into this hospital yesterday, sat in a chair, said nothing, did nothing, and watched a system I helped build decide I didn't belong." Someone coughed gently into a fist. Shaq's gaze turned, locking eyes with one of the attorneys present. "I didn't wear a badge. I didn't flash a name. I didn't pull rank. I wanted to see what it felt like for someone who walks in without the armor of recognition." His eyes moved again. "I didn't have to wonder long. A woman on the board. A marketing exec who'd once pitched using his name in a legacy campaign, cleared her throat. "Mr. O'Neill," she began softly, "had anyone been aware?" "That's the point," he said, cutting her off without raising his voice. "They weren't, because they didn't care to look past the surface. The man they saw wasn't a threat, wasn't unruly, wasn't disruptive, but he was big, and black, and wearing a hoodie. So they made up the rest." Silence fell again, heavier now, and then the door opened once more. Dr. Nathaniel Aldridge stepped in, late, confident, carrying a sleek leather folio under his arm and a Bluetooth earpiece tucked into one ear. His steps faltered when he realized every head was turned toward the end of the table, and then his eyes followed their gaze. When he saw Shaq seated at the head, his jaw tightened. "Is this?" he started, confused. "Is this the admin breach meeting?" "Yes," said the COO flatly. "Take a seat, Dr. Aldridge." There was a pause. Aldridge sat, not where he usually sat. Not near the center. This time he took the furthest open seat near the door, like a man already calculating his exit strategy. Shaq watched him with a gaze that held no malice, only measure. "You filed a complaint," Shaq said, voice level. Aldridge looked up, swallowing once. "Yes, sir. Regarding an unregistered individual accessing ICU hallways." "You mean me?" Aldridge blinked. A long silence. "Yes," he finally admitted. Shaq nodded. "Did I raise my voice?" "No." "Did I threaten anyone?" "No." "Did I violate any law?" "No," Aldridge said again, quieter now. Shaq leaned back. "And yet you reported me, escorted me out, wrote me up as a security risk." "I followed protocol," Aldridge said, trying to recover his posture. "There was no ID, no record. You didn't ask." Aldridge froze. "You saw a man," Shaq continued, "and assumed he didn't belong. Not because of his behavior, but because of your bias." Aldridge opened his mouth. Shaq raised a hand. "No need to explain. The camera footage already did." Murmurs stirred around the table. Clarissa, seated near the COO, slid a folder across the table to the general counsel. Inside were printed stills from the hallway, footage from 2 separate angles, audio transcripts, time-stamped. Dr. Aldridge looked at it but didn't reach for it. "I don't need an apology," Shaq said. "Not from you, not from anyone here. What I need, what this hospital needs, is a reckoning." He turned to the boardroom. "We say this place is about dignity, care, equity. We plaster those words across billboards. But they mean nothing if they aren't practiced in silence, when no one's looking, and no one's watching." The board remained frozen. "Because here's the truth," he said, quieter now. "I don't want to be recognized. I want my mother, and every mother, to walk through those doors and be seen for who they are. Not what they wear, not what box someone checked when they read their name, but seen." He paused, and then delivered the blow that no one was ready for. "This is the man," he said, pointing lightly toward Aldridge, "who tried to throw me out." He let that sit. Then, with surgical precision, he added, "And I own this hospital." Gasps echoed around the room like the sound of dominoes tipping. Aldridge paled.
This man filed a formal complaint.
Shaq said, eyes never leaving Aldridge. "Against the person who signs his paycheck. Against the person who paid for the wing his office sits in." Aldridge opened his mouth. But there was no breath left to support words. Shaq turned toward the COO. "I'm not asking for termination. I'm asking for reflection. For change. For a review of who we allow to hold power, and what they do with it." The COO nodded, scribbling notes that wouldn't be erased. "And starting today," Shaq said, rising from his chair, "I'll be conducting monthly anonymous reviews of patient and visitor treatment across all departments. No names, no warning. Just real people, real tests." He buttoned his jacket, the sound crisp in the silence. Because real power doesn't just build the house, it walks the halls when no one's watching. He turned to Aldridge one final time. "Your degree may have earned you the title, doctor, but your behavior decided whether you deserved it." And with that he walked out. No security, no applause, just presence. Behind him, the boardroom exhaled. Dr. Aldridge sat frozen, the weight of what he'd done finally starting to settle. He didn't just file a complaint. He filed his own resignation letter, without even knowing it. 2 quarterly anonymous visitor surveys to measure staff behavior when no leadership is watching. Another nod. And 3, Shaq added, voice clear. Every department head will spend 1 shift a quarter shadowing an entry-level role. Receptionist, janitor, nurse's aide. No special treatment. No exceptions. There was a collective shift in the room. Not resistance, but surprise. The kind of surprise that precedes necessary discomfort. "We can't lead what we don't understand," Shaq finished. "And we don't protect what we don't value." The board sat in silence, not just because they were stunned, but because they were moved. Dr. Aldridge opened his mouth, then closed it again. Words had always been his currency, but now he was bankrupt. No defense, no justification, only awareness. Shaq stood. He didn't deliver a final punchline. He didn't storm out. He simply walked to the door with the same deliberate calm he had used in every step since walking into that hospital the day before. As he reached for the handle, he stopped, turned once more to face them. "You don't have to thank me. Just be better than yesterday." And with that he left. No applause. No closing statement. Just the sound of a quiet fire, still burning in the hearts of those left behind. Because humiliation was never his weapon. It was their mirror. The change didn't start with an email. It didn't come in the form of a press conference or a banner across the hospital website. There were no headlines, no interviews. The hospital didn't rush to sanitize the narrative or paint itself as a victim of misunderstanding. Instead, something quieter happened. A different kind of momentum. One that began in the corners of conversations and spread through hushed truths, through people who'd waited a long time for someone to finally say, "We see it too." Within 48 hours of Shaq's meeting with the board, the Human Resources Department initiated an internal audit. Not a surface-level sweep, a deep dive, an unfiltered, unscripted review of employee behavior and department culture. No one was warned. No one was protected. Every floor, every shift, every staff member was eligible for confidential interviews. It wasn't just about Dr. Aldridge anymore. It was about everyone. And that's when the stories began to pour in. The night shift nurse, who'd been quietly documenting instances where patients of color received fewer pain meds than others, always dismissed by physicians as low priority. The receptionist who'd overheard an attending refer to a struggling patient as a likely Medicaid liability. The cafeteria worker who'd been routinely ignored by administrators unless a trash bin overflowed. None of these things made it into policy, but they lived between the lines, and now those lines were being read. Aldridge, for all his poise and prestige, found his record cracking under the weight of what hadn't been said until now. It turned out, the hallway incident wasn't an anomaly. It was a pattern, coldness masquerading as protocol, bias stitched into tone, language that excluded, a wall built, one unchallenged assumption at a time. A nurse named Leona shared an account from 2 months earlier, when Aldridge had refused to see a Spanish-speaking family without a translator present, even though their teenage son was fully bilingual and willing to assist. "We don't work with children translators," Aldridge had insisted. But Leona remembered his tone, dismissive, impatient, detached. The family had waited nearly 40 minutes before someone else stepped in. By then, their grandfather's condition had worsened. There was no single bombshell, just a series of tiny truths, stacking like bricks, until a new reality took shape. And all the while, Shaq said nothing publicly. No tweets, no interviews, no camera crews outside the hospital doors. He showed up the next morning in the same hoodie, sat with his mother, spoke to nurses, thanked the janitorial team by name. He didn't need headlines, because real change doesn't come with a spotlight. It comes when no one's looking. Clarissa, meanwhile, found herself walking into an HR meeting where she expected to be asked for clarification. Instead, she was promoted, elevated to senior patient advocate, an administrative role with influence over internal policy, hiring, and interdepartmental behavior audits. Her job wasn't just to file forms, it was to ensure people were treated like people. Her first decision was to create an anonymous submission line for staff who feared retaliation. Within 2 days, it had over 70 entries. The COO issued a quiet directive to each department head. Effective immediately, every physician would undergo bias training, not as a formality, but as a recurring mandatory checkpoint. Anyone resisting would be flagged for behavioral review. Some resisted. Those names went straight to the audit team, and Dr. Nathaniel Aldridge, he was called into HR 3 days later. There was no ceremony, no team of lawyers lined up in defense. Just him, an HR director, a counselor, and a decision. The report had been compiled. Pages of observations, testimony, inconsistencies in his record that had previously been smoothed over by prestige. He'd been seen as untouchable. Now he was under the microscope. They gave him 2 options: undergo a 6-month correctional review process with mandatory counseling, daily evaluations and shadowed work sessions under Clarissa's oversight, or resign quietly with a neutral record. Aldridge stared at the offer like it was written in a foreign language. For the first time in his professional life, his choices were not his own. The hospital he thought he ran had turned into a mirror, and he didn't like what it showed. He took the resignation. It was processed by the end of the day.
No fanfare.
Just an empty office and a nameplate removed with quiet efficiency. Shaq was still in the hospital when it happened. He was sitting beside Lucille, holding her hand while she slept, when Clarissa knocked and stepped inside. "He's gone," she said softly. Shaq nodded once. "I didn't want to ruin him," he said. "You didn't," she replied. "He did that himself." Lucille stirred, eyes fluttering open. Her gaze moved between the two of them, and she smiled faintly. "You fix it?" she whispered. "We're trying," Shaq said, squeezing her hand. "You're not trying," she whispered. "You're showing them how." Downstairs, the hospital was already shifting. Subtle changes at first. Doctors saying good morning to maintenance staff. Nurses double-checking charts, instead of rushing patients based on assumptions. A new sign hung in the staff lounge: respect doesn't need permission. It wasn't about perfection. It was about awareness. And awareness had arrived like a flood. Days later, the footage leaked online. Not through Shaq, not through Clarissa, but through a patient's son, who had been in the waiting area when security escorted Shaq down the hall. His phone had caught the moment, and though the man hadn't known who Shaq was at the time, something about it didn't sit right with him. He uploaded it to a small platform with the caption, "This guy got kicked out of ICU just for sitting. Turns out he built the hospital." The video spread fast. Within hours, news outlets picked it up. Hospital owner mistaken for trespasser. Billionaire profiled in his own building. Shaquille O'Neal teaches a lesson without saying a word. But by the time it hit trending, the real work had already been done. Shaq didn't make a statement. He didn't need to, because the world didn't go viral for wealth. It didn't click for glitter or flex. It clicked because something about watching a quiet man get mistaken for a problem, and choosing grace over retaliation, was more powerful than any staged redemption arc. "You don't go viral for being rich," Clarissa said when the news reached her. Shaq looked up from his phone. "You go viral for being real." The hospital's board issued a statement the next day, short, to the point, and for once honest. No spin. "We failed to recognize the character of a man who helped shape this institution, and in doing so, we failed our mission. But failure can teach, if we listen, and we are listening now." No one asked Shaq to approve the message. They didn't need to. For the first time, they weren't speaking for him. They were speaking because of him. And that made all the difference. They tried to humiliate me, he said quietly. And you let them humiliate themselves. Lucille finished. He looked up. She didn't need to see the video, he thought. She raised the man who lived it. They say I owned this hospital, he said. But it still treated me like I didn't belong. Lucille's eyes didn't harden. They softened. That's because they don't own what you do, she whispered. You walk in with something they can't see. You didn't need to be recognized. You needed to be true. Shaq swallowed hard, his hand tightening slightly around hers. They're changing things now, he said. Clarissa's running point on policy. They pushed Aldridge out. Whole place feels different. Lucille nodded, her breathing a little steadier now. Good, she said. But don't let them make you their symbol, baby. You're not here to fix their mess. You're here to live in what you built. Let them clean their own house. He sat back, letting her words settle. I wanted to burn it all down, he admitted. But I thought of you, she smiled. Then I taught you right. Outside the room, nurses moved with practiced rhythm. Somewhere down the hallway, new patients were being checked in, unaware that this quiet room had become the heart of the hospital's awakening. Word had traveled fast, but it hadn't left the building. Not yet, and it didn't need to. Lucille looked at her son. I remember when you were 10, she said. That time the store clerk followed us around like we were stealing. I remember, he said softly. You were shaking. Angry. I told you, don't ever let someone's suspicion make you smaller. You make them feel what it means to be wrong without ever raising your voice. Shaq smiled faintly. I forgot that for a minute. She shook her head. No, baby. You remembered it when it counted. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded note. He placed it on the tray beside her. What's that? She asked. Letter, he said. From Aldridge. Resignation. But it read more like an apology. Real one. I think he meant it. Lucille looked at the note but didn't touch it. Doesn't matter if he meant it, she said. What matters is if he carries it. Shaq nodded. There was a knock at the door. Clarissa peeked in, smiled when she saw Lucille awake. Good to see you up, she said. Good to be up, Lucille replied. Clarissa walked in, placed a warm hand on her shoulder, then turned to Shaq. They're ready to install the new signage, she said. Shaq raised a brow. Already? Clarissa grinned. Well, turns out when the man who built the building speaks, people move. Lucille watched the exchange, proud but quiet.
What's the sign say? She asked.
Clarissa glanced at Shaq, giving him the space to answer. It's just a plaque, he said, downstairs in the lobby. Small. Lucille narrowed her eyes. What's it say? He looked her in the eye, steady. This building is not a monument to wealth, but to dignity. May every person who enters be seen fully and equally. Lucille's eyes glistened.
You finally wrote a sermon, she said.
Shaq shrugged. You always said I'd preach in my own way. The monitor beside her beeped steadily. A soft reminder that time was still moving, that life still pulsed. But in that moment, time didn't rush. It rested. Right here. Lucille leaned her head back on the pillow.
You know, she said. When I had you, I didn't know how I'd raise a boy in a world that didn't want to see him.
Shaq's voice caught. You raised a man they can't ignore. She smiled again, eyes closing slowly. Good, she whispered. Then I can rest. And in the room where truth had been tested and proven, where silence had spoken louder than protest, a mother and son sat in quiet victory. No spotlight, no applause, just presence. And that, always, had been enough. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. No courier, no formal hospital envelope, just a plain white envelope, with a real stamp, hand-addressed in careful cursive. It stood out from the stack of Manila files and official memos on Shaq's desk. No return address, just his name written across the front. No title, no Mr. No doctor, just Shaq. He turned it over in his hands for a long moment before sliding a finger beneath the seal. The paper inside was thick, slightly textured, folded in 3 parts. It wasn't typed. It wasn't formatted for email or meant to be scanned. It was human. A page written in blue ink, careful script, sentences that didn't try to impress, just confess. Shaq read it slowly, eyes tracing the words that came not with entitlement, but with effort. Shaquiel, I don't expect this to make things right. I'm not writing for forgiveness. I just want you to know I saw it now, what I was, what I missed, and what it cost. I watched the footage again after I left, not to defend myself, just to finally see it through someone else's eyes. And I did. It gutted me. The silence, the way you sat there, the way I talked over you, assumed you were a threat, a problem, a disruption. You never raised your voice. You didn't need to. Your silence spoke louder than any sermon I've ever heard. I've stepped down, as you know, not because they made me, but because I needed to. I was never the man I thought I was, in that white coat. I used authority like it was armor. I weaponized professionalism. I followed rules, but ignored humanity. And it took you, sitting still, doing nothing but being present, to show me who I had become. Shaq paused, hand resting on the edge of the desk. The office around him was quiet. The city view behind him blurred in the afternoon light. He continued reading. I'm working at a community clinic now, down in South Side. No title, no office, just folding chairs and chipped tile floors. And for the first time I actually see people. I hear their stories instead of sorting them by urgency or insurance. I met a woman the other day who reminded me of your mother. She didn't have the words to describe her pain, but she had this look in her eyes, like she'd spent her whole life being brushed aside. This time, I didn't speak first. I let her. You told me once without telling me that power isn't something you wear, it's something you use to lift others. I never learned that in medical school, but I'm trying to learn it now. The letter wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. It was sincere. Stripped of performance, free of the usual justifications that often follow apologies from people in power. Shaq reached the final paragraph. I know I'll never erase what I did, but I'm not trying to anymore. I'm just trying to become someone better on the other side of it. Maybe losing everything was what I needed to finally understand the difference between authority and integrity. Thank you for your patience. For not humiliating me when you could have. For teaching without preaching. I was wrong. And now I'm working on what it means to be right. Nathaniel Aldridge. Shaq folded the letter back up, slowly, carefully, like it was something delicate. He didn't put it in a drawer. He didn't toss it in a pile. He placed it inside a leather notebook he kept on the corner of his desk. One where he collected moments that mattered. Notes from his kids. A letter from Lucille, written years ago after his first philanthropic award. A photo of the rec center where he learned to play ball. This letter belonged there, because it didn't mark defeat. It marked a shift. He leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting to the window, watching the traffic below. The slow-motion swirl of a city always in motion. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel vindicated. What he felt was stillness. It was the same stillness he had carried that day in the hallway, the same one that had unnerved the people trying to move him. Because real stillness doesn't mean inaction. It means certainty. It means knowing who you are, so clearly that the world's noise can't shake you. He thought of Aldridge, now standing in a clinic without a title, stripped of the shine he used to lean on. And for the first time he didn't picture the smug, calculated man who once tried to reduce him to a liability. He pictured a man learning to see, maybe for the first time. And that was something. Maybe not everything, but something. Shaq stood and walked to the bookshelf near the wall. There, tucked between biographies and blueprints, was a simple wood frame. Inside it, a quote Lucille had sent him when the hospital first opened. Just 9 words burned into soft oak. Change doesn't start loud. It starts when you listen. He smiled. Some people find change through applause. Others find it through loss. And a few, just a few, find it through a letter nobody asked for. The smell of fresh paint still hung in the air, soft, earthy, with just a trace of turpentine, faint enough to go unnoticed by most, but distinct enough to mark something new. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the hospital's main lobby, bouncing off polished tile, bathing the room in a calm golden glow. The noise of beeping monitors and fast-moving gurneys lived on in the wings beyond. But here in the heart of Halcyon Medical, there was stillness. At the center of the lobby stood a wall that hadn't existed a month ago. It wasn't structural. It wasn't listed on any blueprint. It had been added later, approved quietly, sketched at night, painted slowly over the course of several days by a local muralist, known for blending realism with light. People watched its progress in silence, unable to guess what it would become.
Now it's complete.
The mural was taller than most people expected. 12 feet from base to ceiling, stretching across nearly the full width of the east lobby wall. But it wasn't its size that captured attention. It was its truth. The central figure was a woman. Her silhouette faced forward, shoulders squared, not in defiance but in certainty. She stood firm, grounded, her stance neither grand nor diminished. just present. Beside her, holding her hand, was a boy, young, wide-eyed, tall for his age. His expression wasn't fear. It was focus. He looked up at her like she was gravity. She looked ahead like she'd already seen the world, and chosen to meet it anyway. Lucille and Shaquille, mother and son, past and present. But that wasn't what stopped people mid-step. It was the inscription painted underneath, simple, elegant, handwritten in clean script. Healing doesn't come from who you are. It comes from how you treat those you don't know. No attribution, no signature, no press release, just a truth that hummed like a heartbeat. The mural had been finished in time for the hospital's quarterly staff gathering, a tradition that had once been formal and buttoned up, but had slowly evolved into something more human. This time, chairs were left open. Employees came dressed as they were. No hierarchy, just people. Food from local vendors lined the edges of the lobby, and music, soft jazz with hints of gospel, played low from hidden speakers. Shaq stood near the back wall, hands in his hoodie pocket, head tilted slightly as he studied the painting. He'd seen the sketches, approved the final design, but standing here now, in front of it, he felt something different. He didn't see a mural. He saw history made visible. He wasn't alone for long. Clarissa approached, coffee in one hand, clipboard in the other. She stopped beside him, took a sip, and looked up at the wall. "She's gonna love it," she said. "She already does," Shaq replied, smiling faintly. Lucille hadn't been back to the hospital yet. She was recovering well, but taking it slow. He hadn't told her much about the mural, just that something beautiful was being built in her honor. She'd laughed and said, "Better be subtle." Shaq thought this was the perfect kind of subtle. "It's good," Clarissa said after a beat. Not loud, not soft either. Just real. "Exactly how she raised me," Shaq said. Clarissa turned to him. "You think they get it now?" Shaq didn't answer immediately. He watched as a nurse approached the mural, arms crossed, head bowed. A janitor joined her, pausing with a mop in hand. Then a security guard, not the one who had escorted him weeks ago, but someone new, stood beside them. They didn't speak, but they stood together, like it meant something. "I think," Shaq said finally, "they're starting to..." As the gathering began to pick up, hospital staff trickled into the lobby. Some wore stethoscopes around their necks. Others wore name tags that said nutrition services or tech support. There was no separation now, no invisible line between coat colors or floor assignments. They moved through the space together, some stopping to greet Shaq with a nod or a handshake, others just catching his eye and offering a simple smile. But no one stopped him. No one asked if he needed help. No one questioned why he was there. And that was the difference. Weeks ago, he'd been treated like an outsider. Now he walked freely, not because people knew who he was, but because they'd learned how to see. That morning, Clarissa had launched a new initiative, the First 15. Every shift, before diving into tasks and checklists, teams across departments would take 15 minutes to connect, to talk. Not just about patient cases or charting procedures, but about empathy, listening, bias, grace. It wasn't mandatory, but attendance was full. The mural wasn't a monument. It was a mirror, and people had started looking. Across the lobby, a familiar face entered quietly, Dr. Moreno, head of pediatrics, who'd once dismissed the need for narrative sensitivity training as fluff. She stood before the mural for a long time, arms wrapped around herself, eyes blinking faster than normal. When Shaq passed her later, she reached out and touched his arm lightly.
"I didn't know what I didn't know," she said. "Thank you for showing me."
He nodded. "No one starts knowing," he replied. "But we all get to choose what we learn." At noon, a short address was given by the COO, brief, authentic, no podium. She didn't mention Aldridge. She didn't mention the scandal. She just talked about what had changed, what was still changing, about how leadership wasn't about control, but stewardship, and how the heart of the hospital would always be the way it treated people when no one important was watching. Shaq watched from the back. He didn't need the mic. He'd already said everything he needed to, without ever raising his voice. Later that afternoon, as the crowd dispersed and the space quieted again, a teenage boy in a school uniform walked into the lobby with his mother. He stared at the mural like it was a photograph from a dream. He turned to his mom. "That's Big Shaq, right?" She smiled. "That's who he used to be. Now he's something more." Shaq caught the exchange, but didn't intrude. He didn't need to. A few minutes later, a nurse from reception approached him. "Hey," she said softly. "I was one of the people who didn't see you that day." Shaq turned to her. Calm. She swallowed. "I didn't speak up. I should have." "You did now," he said. She looked up at the mural, eyes glossy. "She's beautiful." "She is," Shaq said. The nurse stood for a while longer, then excused herself. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows through the glass, Shaq sat on one of the lobby benches, watching people come and go. No one looked rushed. No one looked afraid. And somewhere beneath the tiles and behind the paint, something pulsed. A new foundation. Justice doesn't always crash through walls. Sometimes it hums, quietly, like a current running through wire, unseen, but felt. He looked up once more at the mural, catching the detail in his younger self's eyes. Hope, trust, belief that the hand he held would never let go, and Lucille painted without a crown, but still every bit a queen. He thought back to everything that had happened. The judgment.
The silence.
The letter. The reckoning. And now, a hospital changed, not by slogans, but by truth. By accountability, by listening. Not a perfect place, but better. And as he stood and pulled his hoodie over his head, no one stopped him. No one stared. But this time, they nodded. Not because he was a legend. Not because he was a millionaire. But because he was proof. Proof that silence could be power. That grace could be fire. That presence could become policy. And that the giant they tried to erase had become the standard they now lived by.